Welcome to the Family Philanthropy Speaks video blog series from the National Center for Family Philanthropy. These conversations highlight the innovative spirit of family giving. Today, we meet Edgar Villanueva. Edgar is a globally recognized expert on social justice philanthropy and has become best known as the author of the provocative book, Decolonizing Wealth. He's also a board member of the Andrews Family Fund and Senior Vice President of Programs and Advocacy at the Schott Foundation. Our conversation started with me asking Edgar about his own philanthropic journey and what led him here.
So I grew up in North Carolina, and I grew up in, I'm Native American, so my family has practices, has a worldview that is steeped in indigenous values. And I also come from a family that was quite charitable in the sense of there was an orientation toward helping others. Although we didn't have a lot of money, our lives pretty much rotated around service to community. And I learned from my mom sort of the values of what I think of as a true philanthropist, someone who just really led with love and took care of others. And I always knew that although we didn't have a lot, there were others who had less, and that I had a responsibility to take care of folks, because ultimately we're all related is something that we subscribe to in Native culture, this idea of all my relations. And so I think for me growing up, helping others may have been sort of a way of escaping our own pain, of feeling, to be involved in the lives and improvement of others as a way of helping our own lives and creating a different type of reality for ourselves. So I have been just kind of engaged in this work since I was a kid. And I think for me, finding myself in philanthropy later in life, I ended up going to school to learn to be a minister, seminary, because the church had such a central role in our lives at that time. And that's the only outlet I knew to help others. And when I realized I wasn't going to necessarily have a career in the church, I found my way into the nonprofit sector. And that's where I've been ever since. So I think I have a tradition of giving back, a worldview that is all about caring for others and caring for the planet. And I've been really fortunate to have worked in various organizations where people have given me opportunities and brought me along in my leadership. When it comes to money and philanthropy, it's kind of funny because my mom was a domestic worker when I was a kid. We had this temporary proximity to wealth at times. And, on the weekends, I would go to work with her at times, and I would be in very, affluent homes and be around folks who had a lot of material wealth. And in a lot of ways, I didn't see them as very different from us. They were just people to me. And I think that was like a helpful orientation, because I didn't grow up with sort of this anger toward people who had wealth. I just saw it as like, oh, they were born into that family. I was born into this family, and it's just kind of the way it is. And my family actually benefited from the generosity of a lot of those folks who cared for my mother and made sure we had what we need as a family. I remember people taking me shopping for school clothes and just kind of looking out for us. And so I think that the spirit of generosity, I know, is something that is prevalent in poor communities. We are philanthropists, and also people who have wealth. There's a lot of folks who want to give back and want to use resources to help others. So that's kind of what I've dedicated my life to, I would say, in recent years. And what led me to write the book is recognizing that common humanity and this false divide that's been created between the haves and the have-nots. We're really actually connected, and we're relatives. We all experience pain and suffering. We all have different types of trauma that manifests because of the history of this country in our families that we need to deal with individually, but also collectively. And I think coming together in some way to think about that collective trauma and that collective healing is the answer for moving us forward as a society.
In the book, you talk about this trauma and the influence it's had on our systems and continues to have. So can you talk a little bit about what you term the colonizer virus and what you mean by decolonizing wealth?
Yeah, so 500 years ago, a virus arrived to the shores of this country that is colonization, and we often think about colonization as this romanticized thing that we were taught, that the colonizers were heroes and champions, and they discovered this land and they manifest destiny. We were just really misguided in our history lessons about all of this, because colonization actually was and is a very violent force that entailed genocide and the taking of land and enslavement and all of these horrific acts, all in the name of accumulation, in the name of the accumulation of wealth. And so part of the work that I do is actually just help educate people on the realities of American history and the violent acts of colonization that really undergird our current economic system. And what has facilitated colonization, and when we talk about colonization, it's not just something that in the past, an act that is very much still happening today. But undergirding that, of course, is the ideology of white supremacy that enabled folks to feel superior and to be able to commit acts against others because they were seen as less than human. And so this force of colonization, which is all about dividing, conquering, separating, exploiting, all in the name of generating more and more wealth and hoarding wealth, is something that I feel like is a part of the DNA of our country. And it's very much connected to wealth. And its history has left a trail of trauma. And those dynamics of colonization, which are divide, conquer, control, exploit, they're like a virus that not only have permeated sort of this realm of wealth and wealth accumulation, but it's become sort of a mindset that is so natural to us nowadays that we barely recognize it. I call it the colonizing virus because it has infected our policies, our systems, the way we show up. And yes, it's actually present in philanthropy in our sector, which is a sector that inherently exists to do good and to help others, but we have to understand that where there is wealth accumulation, there is some tie back to the history of colonization in this country. And if we're not aware and clear around how the colonizing virus might be showing up in our work, we can unknowingly be a part of perpetuating harm on communities.
So talk to us a little bit more about how it shows up today.
The way that it shows up in a nutshell for me, I often think about sort of the who, who has wealth, right? And so when we see the demographics and the disparity, the race wealth gap that exists now, we know that by far the majority of folks who hold wealth in the United States are white folks. By far the folks who have the resources to start foundations and the folks who lead foundations at the trustee level and at the staff senior levels are by far white folks. And that's a byproduct of a racialized oppressive history that we have in this country, where we have for generations, even on the other side of slavery and genocide and stolen land, we have consistently enacted policies in this country that have kept people of color in poverty. And so the idea of institutional philanthropy as we know it today is something that's quite foreign to a lot of people of color, because we have not had the resources and the wealth in our families to be able to start family foundations. So it's about the who. It's also about the what. What philanthropy and foundations actually represent. And that's something that we have to, I think, at a certain point in time, be honest about, that we as a sector actually exist as a byproduct of this history of wealth accumulation, right? And I'm not saying that anyone who has a great uncle who started a business and did very well and and created wealth for the family and started a foundation is a bad person. Is of course not, right? But we have to acknowledge that we've had a history that has provided boosts to certain people and set them up, predispose them to the ability to generate wealth in a way that in my community and other communities of color, we have not had those opportunities. So it's sort of the what is acknowledging that history and then thinking about how can we do our philanthropy in a way that's respectful to that history. And then the last thing I'll say, because there are many ways that I think it shows up, but it's also just in the what we're funding. And the fact that only about 8.5% of funding from foundations go to communities of color, I see that as a philanthropic injustice. When we think about the role that people of color have played in building wealth in America, we've created this bounty, through the land that was taken, of course, slavery, which was the largest part of our economic system and how sort of our economy started in this country. There's been a significant role, modern day times, the role of workers of color and how we are constantly helping to build wealth in white communities. And yet with this bounty that we've created, we are not benefiting hardly at all from those resources. In my community, indigenous communities, less than 1% of grant dollars come to us. So I think that's something that's a little bit of an injustice. I don't think that it's actually intentional in a lot of ways. I often say, I don't think that anyone goes to work at a foundation and says to themselves, I can't wait to be racist today. I can't wait to not fund a Black-led organization. But what we have is, we have a system now that's been created that is just propped up to perpetuate the ongoing building of wealth and investment in white communities that has to be examined and deconstructed so that we can actually be more equitable with our resources.
So when we think about this default position, is this truly what you mean by white supremacy? And I'd love for you to share a little bit more about the definition of the term and, quite honestly, how we can start to depersonalize this.
First, what I would say is that when we talk about white supremacy, we're not talking about white people. People are people, but white supremacy is a false ideology that was created it was created to as propaganda to reinforce these acts of colonization. And so it is something that we have all been taught, we've all internalized it. It's something that's reinforced in our media. It's something that's reinforced in textbooks. I read a stat the other day that somewhere like only 28% of school districts even mention Native Americans in the textbooks in K-12 education. I may have my number wrong. It's less than 30. I don't remember the exact number, but we have this active force at play that's like literally like erasing our history and erasing people of color, and I call it like a whitewashing, right? And so we all are swimming in this water of white supremacy, and it's so natural, and it's like a fish in water looking at another fish and say, hey, do you see the water? And they're like, what is water? Because this is how our country was founded, on the premise of white being better, and everything that's been constructed since then, all of these systems and institutions are founded upon that ideology. So it's completely normal, and even we as people of color often internalize that and actually propagate that ideology. So it's not anything that is attacking a group of people, but it's attacking an ideology that is not serving any of us well.
So let's move to action. In the book, you outline 7 steps to heal from the trauma. I'd like to explore a few of the steps that I believe are critical to the evolution of each and every one of us, and certainly of family philanthropy as a sector. The first is listen. You mentioned that we must acknowledge the wisdom of those excluded and exploited by the system. How can philanthropy do this better?
Yeah, in my 15 years of being a grant maker, I was really surprised, and when I was writing the book, had a lot of conversations with people. And in talking to nonprofit leaders, the number one thing that came up for them was that they just really wished that funders would listen. And I don't know, I was just appalled by that because I feel like listening to others is like a just fundamental human right, you know. It's like the easiest thing that we can do, those of us who have privilege and have access to resources. But you know, really there's just something about privilege that often blinds us to understanding the realities of other folks outside of that bubble. I think listening is a superpower, and listening in color is like a mega superpower. And what listening in color really means is that we actually are yielding to the idea of changing the status quo. And it means that we understand that others who have been through through their lived experience experienced you know, poverty firsthand, or a lack of access to health services, or inferior education, you know, those issues that we care about. By actually sitting down and really listening to those folks who have experienced those inequalities, and actually asking what they need and what they want in order to change those conditions, is the best thing that we can do as funders. I think listening as funders means that we have to hold back our own conclusions, our own opinions, our own judgments. It means that we don't need to jump in and say me too, and feel like we are you know, finding some way to connect to that experience. It's okay to actually sit back and take the focus away from ourselves. You know, it's really funny. In my role at SHOT, I am a grant maker, but I also am a fundraiser. And I laugh sometimes because I have meetings with funders. They're 30 minutes, and for 25 minutes, the funders talk. And then I have 5 minutes to try to talk about our work at SHOT, right? So I think it's just this place of privilege that people find themselves in, that they're just blinded to the fact that they're not listening. So ultimately, if we really care about impact, if we really want to see change in the world, we have to truly believe that those closest to the pain have the right solutions. And we need to, you know, a way of decolonizing our work is to give people the dignity and the self-determination to do work in a way that is appropriate for their communities. So it's listening, but it's also responding in a way that respects and supports communities to make the changes in the way that they see fit.
So many listening today might ask, when and how does that play out in my grant making cycle, right? And I'd love to hear from you about your experience at Andrus, at SHOT. You know, how does listening actualize?
You know, it really does come about by being in a relationship. I often compare grant making to dating or being in a relationship or a marriage, because it is very much about being in relationship. And so listening is something that should happen across the entire process of grant making. You know, at Andrus, at SHOT, in both institutions, we provide general operating support. So I think even on the front end, and how the type of support we provide was designed by listening, because through listening, we know that nonprofits prefer and benefit most from general operating support, funding that is given to them in a trust-based way to do their work without the confines of you know, or forced assimilation to some theory of change that was created by a foundation. Now, I'm not saying that people who work in foundations don't know things, right? Like, we're smart people. I believe in data, I believe in research, but we have to balance that out with what works best in our communities. And as more and more foundations are coming on board with the idea of equity, we have to be willing to let go of some of those default ways of designing grant making strategies that are based on research. Because what we know about research is that, you know, we see white supremacy culture there as well, right? That the folks who are providing the data many times are not researchers of color. They have not adequately collected data or done research on communities of color. And so even there, those folks who have the privilege and the ear of philanthropy, that ends up, you know, resulting in grant making strategies that are created and find themselves leaving out a perspective from communities of color. So I think it's responding to providing general operating support so that we can be in relationship with folks. It's also clearly saying to them, because we hold the power in this relationship, that this money is coming to support your organization or your work in the way that you see fit. And you need to know that I'm not here to police you. I'm not here to micromanage. I want to be in relationship with you. I think the true test of knowing that you are doing well as a listener, as a funder, is when a grantee can come to you and say, hey, something's not working here with this program. We decided we need to change this. We need to go a different direction, or we made a mistake or something failed. If a grantee can come to you and like share that, because they know you're really going to receive that and hear them, and there's not going to be any like repercussions for that, but you're going to say, hey, thanks for sharing that. Let me know how I can support you in figuring this out. Let's take a different direction. Let's change the course of this work. That's when you've really achieved a place of listening.
I want to end with one last question here. On your website, you have a brilliant quote, one that motivates me certainly every day in my role. You say, philanthropy, it's time for an intervention. So I would love for you to talk a little bit more about what you hope for the sector, what you hope for families that are pursuing a commitment to give back, to do good. What do you hope this intervention will yield?
Ultimately, my North Star is to see balance in the world. And I know everyone feels the imbalance now. Climate is like out of control and the planet is suffering. Our young people are suffering because of a lack of equal opportunity to quality public education. There's just a lot of suffering and pain, and things are imbalanced. Money is deeply connected to that. And when you can look at any issue, when you begin to peel back the layers, it all comes back down to money and who is benefiting and profiting off of pain, and who has power and who has resources. The only way that we're going to address all of this is through a sense of balance. So I hope that foundations will actually seize the opportunity to say, well, we have some resources here. What can we do to contribute to that balance? I want to see the amount of investment in communities of color dramatically increase. I'm really embarrassed when I say that only 8.5% go to communities of color. I think we have failed as a sector when that is the case. I want to see us democratize how we do this work and actually be more connected to community. And that may mean, changing the way that foundations are governed. I think that's definitely one avenue to do that. I think foundations can take up the mantle or the charge to think about processes of racial healing and truth and reconciliation. Because our government has failed to have a process of truth and reconciliation, I deeply believe that process is something that we have to have as a country in order to get to a place of racial healing. And so foundations can actually play a role in supporting that. We can support truth and healing, at a local level. We can support it among our grantee partners. We can support it as a part of what our families do. And so I think to orient ourselves around a healing framework and think about how can we best use resources in a way that is going to close the race wealth gap and bring about connection between people. That's what I want to see. There's no such thing really as a bad grant. Like, all nonprofits are doing good work. All work is important, but we need to prioritize for the next several years. We've got to prioritize communities of color that have been marginalized and have not had a fair share of the resources in order to catch them up and to balance things out. So that's really what I want to see. I want to see philanthropy fully living into its role. I think as leaders in communities, as gatekeepers of resources, to be fully informed, to be fully leading from a place of love. And because we have the capacity and the resources, we can actually do that work. Like, we have the privilege to do that hard work of grappling with white supremacy and being on the forefront of supporting those organizations that are leading that work on the ground. So yeah, I mean, those are, I guess I have a lot of desires, but ultimately I want people to find their own liberation. It's not about charity. In this work, it's about, I often say when I'm advocating for funding for Native communities, Black communities, I'm actually extending a lifeline into your own humanity, into your own liberation. I want to see everyone get free, and it starts by collectively taking ownership and investing in our collective liberation.
Brilliant words to end on. Edgar, I can't thank you enough for your time, for your openness, for the challenge that you've given each and every one of us in the family philanthropy community to continue to grow in this work. And I just am so grateful for this conversation. So thank you for your time, Edgar. And we look forward to continuing to follow all the great work that you are doing. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nick.